What's up, fam? I'm back with another short broadcast, and this one is going to be short, sweet, to the point. Um, I've had some negative comments, and I've had some folks that have come out on me, and they have come out on me hard. And I'm assuming that they coming out on me hard because I'm speaking the truth. Because usually, if you ain't speaking the truth and you ain't saying nothing that amounts to nothing, usually people don't have anything to say and you don't get any pushback. But I'm getting some pushback. I'm getting some backlash for some things I've had to say on my last 2 or 3 videos, and because of that, even though this topic this has crossed my mind several times, I decided that I just wasn't gonna do it. But now, because of the backlash and the pushback, now I know that my message is getting through to somebody. So I'm just gonna go all out. I'm just gonna go all out, and I'm gonna do what my mind is telling me needs to be done. So let's get on into this. Now, as you can see from the thumbnail and from the title, and as you can see from the picture that should be on your screen right about now, I want to talk about ADOS, but I don't want to talk about ADOS, the organization, or the people that follow the organization, or the leaders, or anything like that. That's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, since ADOS, the organization, says that they're doing the work, they're doing the politics, they are doing the work as far as reparation is concerned, then I'm assuming, and I may be wrong, but I'm assuming that at some point they are going to start some type of legal proceedings or some type of legal process to bring the case for reparations before the courts. That's just what I'm assuming, that at some point, they intend to do this. Okay? And if that's the case, then whoever decides to start this process, or whoever decides to do this process, or whatever, if they're going to do it under the ADOS acronym, ADOS, and the wording that goes along with that ADOS stands for, American Descendants of Slavery, then there are some issues that need to be addressed before they start getting the paperwork together and start drafting legal documents, and start finding the laws that they're going to base the whole suit on, or the whole case, or whatever. They need to maybe think about making some adjustments to the designation as far as American Descendants of Slavery is concerned. So based on what you see on your screen, what I want to do is I want to break down from top to bottom. I want to break down the issues with American Descendants of Slavery. I want to break down the issues that any court would automatically see. And if these issues are not resolved before you take this case to court, these issues alone are enough to get your case thrown out. Okay? So that's the reason why it needs to be broken down. It needs to really be looked at, and there are some changes that need to be made. Now, remember, this is simply on a legal basis. This is simply if ADOS, if the organization or whatever finally decides that they're going to take this case before any court to argue for reparations. Okay? Now, the first word that we want to deal with is the A, American, right? And understand that American Descendants, American is describing the descendants. In this arrangement of words, American, which is a nationality, which describes people that live in and that are citizens of America. American is describing the descendants that we're talking about. American descendants. Right? Okay. So hopefully we can agree on that. That American is describing the descendants that we're talking about. Right? Okay, but the problem with that is just saying American is too broad. Why? Because we have two classifications of Americans. We have native born Americans, and native born Americans are Americans who their lineage in America goes back 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. They were born in America. Their parents were born in America. Their grandparents were born in America. Their great grandparents were born in America. Their great 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 grandparents were born in America. So that's what a native born American is. Someone who does not have any immigrant in their direct lineage, at least for 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, right? That's a native born American. So that's the first classification of American. The next classification of Americans are immigrants. And you have two types of immigrants. You have the first generation immigrant or the foreign born immigrant, which refers to people born outside of the United States to parents who neither of the parents was a citizen of the U.S., a citizen of the United States, right? That's a first generation immigrant. And, they came here, they migrated here from somewhere else, and they were here long enough to get their citizenship, or they came here with their parents when they were children, and by the time they got ready to go to school or whatever, they were American citizens, that type of thing, right? Then you got the second generation, which it refers to people born in the United States with at least one immigrant parent. So that's a second generation immigrant. So you have two classifications of Americans. You have native born Americans who, like I said, can trace their lineage back in America for 5, 6, 7 generations. And then you have immigrant Americans who are either first generation immigrants or second generation immigrants. Second generation immigrants are the children that were born here with maybe one immigrant parent. First generation are the ones that migrated here. The parents weren't from here. The child was born in another country, but they came here with their parents. And they got citizenship after they were born. So when you look at ADOS and you look at the American part, and like I said, the American describes what descendants you're talking about. The descendants are American, right? Well, if you just leave it at American, then you're leaving it open for not only native born Americans, but you're also leaving it open for immigrant Americans, those first and second generation immigrants. So that's the first issue, right? Okay. The second issue is descendants. Now, and we're going to be using legal definitions in this broadcast because, like I said, I'm talking about when they finally decide that they're going to present a legal case and they're going to take a legal case to court to argue for reparations for ADOS. So the legal definition of descendants are those who are the issue of an individual, such as children, grandchildren, and their children, to the remotest degree. Descendants are those in a descending line of birth from an individual, rather than an ascending line, which are your ancestors, such as the parents of the individual, right? So the descendants is going back. The ancestors are going back. Your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, those are that's the ancestry. The descendants is moving forward, the children, the grandchildren, the great grandchildren, that type of thing. So descendants are, of course, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren in a descending line of birth, right? Okay, so we understand what descendants are. And remember, we're talking about American descendants. So the descendants are American. We already know that. We know that the descendants are American. But we don't have any special way of identifying which Americans we're talking about. Because again, we have two classifications of Americans. We have native-born Americans and we have immigrants. First, second generation immigrants. So something is going to have to be added to that American either before or after to let you know the descendants that we're talking about. Yes, they're American descendants, but which American? Native-born Americans who can trace their ancestry back 5, 6, 7 generations, or immigrant Americans who can only go back to first or second generation. Right? So the word descendants is okay, left by itself. But when you say descendants of slavery, okay, there are a lot of descendants of slavery. There has been slavery in a lot of places. So what type slavery are we talking about? What location are we talking about? Are we talking about descendants of Jamaican slavery? Are we talking about descendants of Haitian slavery? Are we talking about descendants of slavery in Venezuela or in Brazil or in Mexico or in Africa? Because, there were, some forms of slavery in Africa at one point. So which slavery are we talking about? We understand that these are the descendants of that slavery, but which slavery are we talking about? Are we talking about chattel slavery here in America, in North America? Are we talking about the British slavery in the Caribbean? The French and Dutch slavery and all of that and all of this stuff that was going on in Haiti with the French over there and all of these different folks that was over there in Haiti. So what slavery are we talking about? We understand that we're talking about descendants of that slavery. But what slavery? Where? So you're going to need something we're talking about again for legal purposes. You're going to need something to identify the geographical location of the slavery that you're talking about. Because slavery was everywhere. Slavery was global. So if you just say descendants of slavery and you don't talk about which specific slavery you're talking about, then that could mean the descendants of slavery that was in Jamaica. That could mean the descendants of slavery that was in Africa. That could mean the descendants of slavery that was in Haiti. That could mean the descendants of slavery that was in France. That could mean the descendant of slavery that's been all over the globe. So you're going to have something that identifies the particular location of the slavery that you're talking about. So we got a problem with this broad term American because we have two classifications of American, and you're going to have to narrow it down to the specific group of Americans that you're talking about. The word descendant, we don't have a problem with that word on its own. But when you add it with descendants of slavery, then you're going to have to be very, very specific, talking about what slavery. Slavery where? What particular place are you talking about where this slavery took place? So you're going to need something to identify the specific geographical location or whatever of the slavery that you're talking about. But out of all of this, even if you could get away with the American, even if you could get away with the descendants of slavery, even if you could get away with that, well, the descendants of, the one thing that you're not going to be able to get away with and that you really, really need to seriously think about changing is that word slavery. Because you cannot be a descendant of slavery. You can be a descendant of slaves, but you cannot be a descendant of slavery. I'll tell you why. Again, we're talking about legally now. We're talking about legal stuff. Now, I've looked up several definitions of slavery. In some places, they talk about slavery being a practice. In other places, they talk about slavery being the state of being a slave or being enslaved. So they call it a state, meaning a condition. But I've chose this Wikipedia because it's more legal. Slavery is any system in which principles of property law are applied to people, allowing individuals to own, buy, and sell other individuals as a de jure form of property. Meaning, and that word de jure means, in law and government, de jure describes practices that are legally recognized. So slavery was a practice that was legally recognized all over the world at one point. There are still places that you know, they may not legally recognize it, but it's still going on, regardless of whether the practice exists in reality. So that's what de jure means. And property here, they're talking about personal property. You know, like your car is your personal property. Like your clothes are your personal property. Like well, your home is real property because it's real estate. But everything that you have inside of it is your personal property. It belongs to you. You have the right to sell it. You know, you have the right to throw it away. You have the right to trash it or whatever because you own it and it's your property, right? Okay, let me read that again. Slavery is any system. Like I said, in some definitions, it was called a practice. In other definitions, it was called a state or a condition of being, right? Slavery is any system in which principles of property law are applied to people, allowing individuals to own, buy, and sell other individuals as a de jure form of property. A slave is unable to withdraw unilaterally from such an arrangement and works without remuneration. Now I'm going to go down here and we're going to talk about chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, also called traditional slavery, is so named because people are treated as the chattel, personal property, of the owner and are bought and sold as commodities, like stocks, bonds, commodities, assets. Typically, under the chattel slavery system, slave status was imposed on children of the enslaved at birth. Although it dominated many different societies throughout human history, this form of slavery has been formally abolished and is very rare today. Even when it can be said to survive, it is not upheld by the legal system of any internationally recognized government. Okay? Understand that chattel slavery was an institution in the United States of America. It was an institution. It was the law of the land for years. For hundreds of years, it was the law of the land. Something becomes an institution when it's so big and it's so ingrained in the society that it just becomes a part of everyday life. Right? But as a system, as a practice, as a law, as an institution, as a state of being, it can't have descendants. You can't be a descendant of slavery. A human being can't be a descendant of an institution. A human being can't be a descendant of a practice. A human being can't be a descendant of a system. So the descendants can't be descendants of slavery. They have to be descendants of slaves. They have to be descendants of other people. They have to be descendants of their past relatives, their ancestors. Remember what we said the definition of the legal definition of descendant is. Descendants are those who are the issue, meaning the offspring of an individual, such as children, grandchildren, and their children, to the remotest degree. So you can't be a descendant of a system. You can't be a descendant of a practice. You can't be a descendant of a law. And slavery was law. Slavery was the law. It was upheld by the law. It was created by the law. Slavery was the law. And you can't be a descendant of a law. So for legal purposes, that word slavery, for it to really mean what it's supposed to mean, especially when you're talking about taking it into a court of law, when you're talking about going into a court of law to argue for reparations for these descendants, you're going to have to be very specific that you're not talking about the descendants of slavery, because there can be no descendants of slavery. Slavery can't produce living offspring. You understand what I'm saying? Slaves can produce living offspring who are then automatically enslaved under slavery. But slavery itself cannot produce living offspring. It cannot produce descendants. Only slaves can produce descendants. So even if you could get by with everything else, American descendants of slavery, even if you could get by with the American, the descendants of whatever, that slavery word is where you're going to get your hiccup. Because you cannot be a descendant of a system, of a practice, of a law. You can't be a descendant of it. So that's the breakdown I wanted to do on the acronym itself and the words that the acronym stand for. So again, let's go over this and make sure we're very, very clear. American. You got two classifications of Americans. You got native-born Americans who can trace their lineage back 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 generations. Right here on American soil. Were born and bred right here for the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever generation. No immigrant in the lineage nowhere for at least 6 or 7 generations. Right? That's native-born Americans. Everybody was born here. Then you have immigrants. First and second generation immigrants. The immigrants who migrated here and became citizens. Migrated here, were born over there and came here as children and became citizens or whatever. Those are first generation immigrants. Then you have the second generation immigrants who were born here, but they have an immigrant parent. They have at least one parent that was not born here. So you got two classifications of Americans. And if you don't want to open your lawsuit up, or if you don't want to open your action up to everybody, then you're going to have to be very, very specific about which Americans you're talking about. Now, in that, I don't think you have to say Black Americans or whatever, because when you take care of the slavery part, then that'll take care of being very specific about the group of Americans that you're talking about. But you're going to have to be very, very specific about the group of Americans that you're talking about. Second, you're going to have to be very, very careful, very, very specific about the slavery that you're talking about. Whether it was slavery here in America or whether it was slavery abroad. You're going to have to be very specific about that. So you're going to have to say American. You're going to have to put that American behind descendants. You're going to have to. Because people have to know what what slavery you're talking about. Where did this slavery take place? Because if you leave it just at descendants of slaves or descendants of slavery, we got, like I said, because we're going to have to change that slavery. But if you just leave it at descendants of slaves, okay, there are people all over the world who can claim the status of being descendants of slaves. But you want the court to know that you're specifically talking about descendants of American slaves. Not Caribbean slaves, not Haitian slaves, I know, not African slaves, but American slaves. And again, you're going to have to remove slavery and put slaves in its place, because you cannot have descendants of slavery. Technically, biologically, you cannot have descendants of slavery, because slavery cannot produce human offspring. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm going to make any kind of suggestions about what it should be. But for legal purposes, this wording is going to have to be looked at if the ADOS organization or any lawyers that come together to get this case together and to get these legal documents drafted and drawn up and all of that, so that they can present this reparations case before the court. If they want to be taken seriously and not have it thrown out just for technicalities because of the wording, because the wording is not right, because the wording does not make sense. And you got to understand, the court is going to be looking for any little thing that they can find to throw the case out, because it's not something that any court in America wants to deal with. It's not something that any court in America wants to wrestle with, because there's questions of the Constitution, there's questions of amendments, there's questions of treaties, there are questions of all kinds of things that are going to come up when the time finally comes for some court to have to deal with this. And they're not going to want to deal with it. So they're going to be looking for any little minute thing that they can find to use it as a reason to just throw it out, so that they don't have to deal with it. So I'm just here to make sure that that doesn't happen, that you don't give them that kind of reason, that if they throw it out, that you make them throw it out for a real reason. You make them actually have to look at the case, and you let them know that you're serious about this. You're serious about bringing this case for reparations for foundational Black Americans. So that's something that's going to have to be looked at. Now, how the ADOS organization or its leaders or whatever, how they decide to fix this is entirely up to them. But before they do anything serious, as far as bringing any kind of action, any kind of legal action on behalf of ADOS for reparations, before they go before any senates or before they produce any kind of written agenda to give to any kind of politician or whatever the case may be, you're going to have to look at this. Because if I'm not a politician, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge, I'm not any of that. So if I could see the discrepancies and the little small issues and see how these issues can be turned into something major, if I can see it, and other people have touched on it, they haven't went into it like I have, but other people have touched on it. And because they touched on it, I know that that either they saw exactly what I was seeing, or they saw that something just wasn't right. Something just wasn't falling together. Something just wasn't making sense. And see, black folk, we got to do things with excellence. We have to do things 10 times better than other groups do if we want to be taken seriously. And if ADOS is really ready to put in the work, and if ADOS is really ready to, to take this reparations thing as far as they can take it, then they're going to have to look at this. They're going to have to look at this acronym, and they're going to have to look at this wording, and they're going to have to get it right. They're going to have to get it right, or just like everything else that has ever been given that was supposed to be specifically for foundational Black Americans, that was supposed to be specifically for us. If ADOS doesn't fix this, and somehow or another we get some form of reparation, simply because of this wording, it's going to be made available to everybody. Because everybody that can claim to be an American is going to find a way to claim to be a descendant of slavery or slaves. So if this is not fixed, that's exactly what's going to happen. If anything, nobody else is going to say anything about it. Nobody else is going to point these things out, because they're going to be like, okay, well, if they didn't see it, and that's what we want to do anyway. We want to make everything available to everybody else. We want to open it up to everybody. That's the reason why we use words like minority and words like people of color and words like marginalized groups and stuff, and words like diversity. That's the reason why we use those words when we're dealing with Black folks and when we're dealing with the Black community, because we don't want to give them anything that's just for them. We don't want to do anything that's just for them. So they're not going to point this out to you. They're not going to point this out to anybody in the organization to let you know that if you leave it like this and you somehow or another manage to get something in a tangible form, it's going to be open to everybody. It's going to be open to everybody that can claim to be an American, and it's going to be open to everybody that can claim to be a descendant of slavery anywhere. So to avoid that happening, because I'm trying to give ADOS, because these people are just so adamant that they doing politics, you know what I'm saying, and that they got the reparations thing on the move. You understand what I'm saying? And that they have accomplished more as far as reparations is concerned than anybody else has in the last 5, 6, 7 decades, or whatever the case may be. They're so adamant about that. Okay, well then let's get it done. Y'all get it done. Instead of beefing on Twitter and on social media with folks, instead of attacking folks all the time, you understand what I'm saying? Instead of being in everybody's comment section, with all of this foolishness, okay, shut up and get it done. And because I am a foundational Black American descendant of American slaves, because that's who I am, because I am DOAS, because that's who I am, okay, I want you to get it done. Because I'm old just like you are old. They owe me a debt just like they owe you a debt. They owe my ancestors a debt just like they owe your ancestors a debt. So if you're going to do it, I want you to get it done. So my thing is, okay, let's work on this right here. Because if you leave it as is, and like I said, you somehow manage to get through, if you get any tangibles, you opening it up to everybody. You even open it up to the dominant society, to white people who can say, okay, well, I'm an American. I mean, you didn't distinguish which group of Americans you were talking about. You didn't distinguish what Americans you were talking about. So I'm an American. You understand what I'm saying? And my great, 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 great grandmama was a slave. So I'm also a descendant of slaves. Boom. First and second generation immigrants. Well, I'm an American. And my family is from Jamaica. My family is from Haiti. My family is from somewhere in South America. And we are descendants of slaves. So, boom, I'm an American descendant of slaves. So when you leave it like this, because what you've said on videos and what you've said on a post and what you've said in a report here or in a report there, none of that is going to matter. All that's going to matter is what the judge is looking at in front of them as far as the legal documents are concerned. All that's going to matter is what that politician is looking at as far as this written agenda, this written proposal for a black agenda that you have presented to them. At that point, what you said on a video or what you said on a live or what you said at a conference or what you might have said on a Twitter post or whatever, none of that matters. You've got to be very, very, very specific in identifying all of these groups that you're talking about. You've got to be very specific in identifying exactly what group of Americans you're talking about, because that identifies the descendants. So you've got to be very, very specific in identifying what descendants you're talking about, what American descendants you're talking about, what group of American descendants you're talking about. You have to be very specific with that. You have to be very, very specific with where the slavery took place. Was this slavery that took place in America, or was this slavery that took place outside of America? So you're going to have to be very specific about that. And you're going to have to be specific about slaves, descendants of slaves, not descendants of slavery. You cannot be a living, breathing human descendant of slavery, because slavery cannot produce human offspring. Only people can produce human offspring. Only people can have human descendants and human ancestors. So you're going to have to change that slavery to slaves. But you're going to have to talk about what slaves you're talking about. You're going to have to be specific about what slaves you're talking about. Are they American slaves, Jamaican slaves, Haitian slaves, African slaves? No, we can't even, you can't even put the word African slaves in there. It has to be American slaves. And you have to distinguish what group of American descendants you're referring to. So, like I said, because I am a foundational Black American, and because I am a descendant of American slaves, I'm an American descendant of American slaves. Because of that, I'm a Native American descendant of American slaves. Because of that, if you gonna do the work, if you gonna do the politics, if you gonna get this done, then get it done and get it done right, so that you don't have to keep going over and over and over and over and over again behind little small technicalities like this. Because again, they're going to be looking for any small, minute thing that they can find so that they can throw it out, because they don't want to deal with it. So that's it. That's what I had for this for this broadcast. That's what I wanted to present to you, and I hope that everybody takes this seriously. I hope everybody just stops for a minute, get out of all of that other stuff, and really, really take a look at this and really understand that left the way it is, under legal circumstances, left the way it is, under circumstances of doing an actual proposal and an actual Black agenda in writing and presenting it to a politician or or some congressman or somebody who's willing to say, okay, let's look at what you got, let's see what you're talking about and all of that. It's got to be specific. It's got to be specific, and it's got to be specifically targeted for the people that it's supposed to be helping, the people that you're supposed to be fighting for reparations for. Because again, like I said, if you leave it like it is, and somehow or another you manage to get some kind of tangibles, well, leaving it like this, you're going to leave it open to entirely too many people. And it'll be another case of they gave us something that didn't benefit us, something that benefited everybody else. And because it benefited everybody else, we were still left on the bottom. So everybody give it some thought, and y'all have a good night.